panel today is looking at the external conduct standards. We have three speakers and I've decided to introduce them very briefly so that we have as much time as possible for the speakers to talk and for you to ask questions of them and to share insights. So today on our panel we have Richard Hunt from McCulloch Robertson, Andrew Lind from Corney and Lind Lawyers, and Sari Baird from Oxfam Australia. Richard's going to speak first. He's going to introduce us to the standards for those of you who still need an introduction on some of the interpretive issues that concern him as a legal practitioner in terms of interpretation, and indeed concerned us all when we were talking about the standards last night. And then Sari's going to end with some reflections, both in terms of the process through which Oxfam, implements these standards, but also thinks about the purpose behind these standards and the learning that comes from these standards and the causes or some of the catalysts behind the need for these standards. Okay, so thanks, Richard.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before I kick off, just thinking with the theme of the conference, could I have an example from someone in the crowd that's either involved or regularly donates to a charity that's operating overseas? Got one immediately in front of me, so what's an example of a charity that you regularly sponsor or donate to overseas?
Compassion.
What is it?
Compassion.
And what does it do?
Helps orphans in various countries around the world.
Okay. And when you're donating to that, what do you, what are you interested in its governance? Are you interested in the sort of, the ins and outs of how it's doing its record keeping? It's like what's really motivating you?
The children that get the benefit.
Yeah. And what I'm thinking about, in addition to that, is I'm here in Australia. I'm not able to actually be in some of these locations where I know that there's people that are doing very good things. And in terms of the value that a lot of organizations, a lot of charities are adding, is that they are in geographies and locations that we aren't. They have the skill sets that are needed to deliver some of these things. And I think that from an Australian charities context, in particular from an ACNC context, it's how are we actually regulating some of those activities in a way that provides for the trust and confidence to the wider Australian public, including donors like you, volunteers of the organization, the members of the organization, and so on. So that, for me, that's really the context of the discussion. I'm conscious that we've got very, very limited time, so 5 minutes to go through this. So it's going to be very, very high level, and Andrew will build on this in terms of the application, and I'm sorry, it's going to provide some really practical insights into it. So just to go into that, really, I don't want to spend too much time, but the governance standards are really broken into two standards on public accountability in financial matters and two on conduct outside of Australia. The external conduct standard 1 involves activities and control of resources, so this includes funds that are being applied overseas, annual review of overseas activities and record keeping, and anti-fraud and anti-corruption, and finally, protection of vulnerable individuals. So what are they trying to achieve? It's really that they're trying to achieve where funds are being sent outside of Australia. I'm going to skip to this one, where funds are being sent outside of Australia, that they're being used for the proper purpose. They're actually reaching legitimate beneficiaries, and also that they're not being used in misappropriate ways that could support criminal activities, that could support terrorist financing, and so on. But also it's the actual activities and the conduct of individuals, and the regulator has a number of tools in order to deal with these. So Division 50 of the ACNC Act enables this, enables the regulations. The regulations initially came out in 2013 and with the relevant amendment late last year, and the regulations taking effect late last month. In terms of External Conduct Standard 1, the first two would be, I think, reasonably familiar to organizations that are looking to comply based on the existing ACNC governance standards. So this is really that they need to take reasonable steps to ensure activities outside Australia are carried out in a way that's consistent with its purpose and character as a not-for-profit entity. But also there's internal controls to ensure resources, including funds, are being used in a way that's consistent with that character and purpose. The third bullet point, I think, is interesting, and that and sorry, we'll go into this a little bit more detail in terms of the third parties. And I'll just put up a bit of a definition, and it's very, very wide. It's very broad. It involves formal and informal collaboration. It can deal with membership, associations, alliances with third parties, or actual formal arrangements. And one of the other interesting things about External Standard 1 is that there's really this other concept that deals with compliance with Australian laws involving activities overseas, things like terrorist financing, money laundering, and so on. It feels a lot like Governance Standard 3, and you know, while the ACNC doesn't have resources to be going and policing these matters, there is an understanding that it's that the organization would need to have reasonable controls to actually deal with them. I'm not going to go through the ACNC guidance on each of these. It's all available online, and I understand these slides will be made public afterwards. So I encourage everyone to go on the ACNC's website to take a look at some of these things. Annual record keeping, again, I think that this will be very similar to what organizations are probably already doing, but in the context of activities overseas, it's really organizing it on a country-by-country basis for each financial year, where it's either operating or giving resources, sending money overseas, and maintaining information that can support the expenditure that's being applied overseas during those financial years. Again, the guidance will be made available afterwards. External Conduct Standard 3, so we're dealing with anti-fraud and anti-corruption matters. And so this a lot of this will resemble, you know, some of the expectations and in standards in Governance Standard 5. There's a number of things that organizations can do in terms of to minimize this, to document it, have clear and coherent policies, avoid conflicts of interest, and so on. Finally, External Conduct Standard 4, and the protection of vulnerable individuals. Sorry, we'll be able to add some context in this, but there's really two broad ways. One is where vulnerable individuals are the beneficiaries, so that their services, funds or activities that are directed to vulnerable individuals. And secondly, where vulnerable individuals are actually engaged by the organization or relevant third party to deliver some of those services. Again, the guidance will be made public. So, you know, with that, Andrew's going to talk a little bit about the application, some of the key definitions, and so I'll hand it over to you, Andrew.
Good afternoon, everyone. The Law Council of Australia Not-for-Profit and Charity Law Committee had a meeting last night, and we were talking about the external conduct standards, and as a committee we do offer our continued desire to be of assistance to the Commission, perhaps in the issuing of a version 2 of the current guidance on the ACNC's website that might deal with some of the terms that we're finding in practice. Some of our clients are trying to wrap their heads around what they might actually mean. Meaning of terms like operates, collaborates, arrangements and the like, which don't seem to have a settled, clear meaning. Some guidance from the regulator would be of great assistance. I'm going backwards, let's go forwards, shall we? All right, I want to talk about two things, principally. I want to talk about operating outside Australia, firstly, and then I want to talk about some consequences of breach of the external conduct standards. Broadly, the standards apply for a registered charity operating outside Australia in whole or in part. Each of the standards contains these words. The standard applies to a registered entity that is operating outside Australia or working with third parties operating outside Australia. And then Regulation 50.4 again repeats this notion in subsection 1 of operating outside Australia in whole or in part. And then subsection 2 has a little bit of a convoluted carve-out around incidental matters. Now, when you read about incidental matters, you can sometimes put a preconceived notion on that, saying, well, if our overseas activity is only incidental, maybe these standards don't apply. That would not be correct. So let's unpack what Regulation 50.4 means. Oh, what did I do? I turned it off. That's really helpful, isn't it? Good. I call this doing the hokey pokey, where you put your whole self in and your whole self out, but you put your part self in and your part self out. So I'm going to talk about the incidental that's caught and then the incidental that's not caught. All right. So the incidental that's caught is any frontline purpose delivery outside Australia. Any, even if it's really small. Not caught is incidental activity outside Australia related to frontline purpose delivery in Australia. Now, what does that mean? Well, again, the explanatory memorandum helps us and provides a couple of examples. The left-hand column being out or not caught, the right-hand column being in or caught by the external conduct standards. So out or not caught includes an Australian charity working with the homeless in Australia who, as an incidental part of its expenditure, buys some blankets from overseas to help keep the homeless in Australia warm. All right, so not caught. What is caught is a church in Australia that passes the offering bag around to collect a very modest offering to send for some overseas relief work as a one-time payment. That activity is caught, and the external conduct standards apply to that activity. That is operating outside Australia in part. Right, let's talk about some consequences of breach of the external conduct standards. And this is apart from the consequences of reputational damage, harm to beneficiaries, misuse of charitable resources, apart from all of those things. The usual ACNC enforcement powers apply to federally regulated entities, but then there's some things that may not be immediately apparent. There are a number of the usual ACNC enforcement powers, for example, power to give warnings, give directions, accept enforceable undertakings. They're not limited to federally regulated entities in respect of the external conduct standards, and there is no carve-out for basic religious charities. Remember, these standards apply to all charities, including basic religious charities. So basic religious charities are susceptible to a number of the enforcement powers of the ACN regulatory toolbox of the ACNC that they might not otherwise be subject to in terms of compliance with these external conduct standards. That even though these standards apply to the registered entity, there are consequences for governors of suspension or removal if these standards are not complied with. But currently there is an express carve-out that does not apply to basic religious charities. And of course, for all charities, the ultimate sanction of possible deregistration applies. Let me just show you, this surprised me when I was preparing these slides, as to why these enforcement powers don't just apply to federally regulated entities. So when you go to some of these sections about warnings and directions and enforceable undertakings, including Division 100 about suspension and removal of responsible entities, we've got this language around the Commissioner can exercise power under this subdivision. Paragraph A, if the registered entity is a federally regulated entity and the Commissioner reasonably believes that the Act is not going to be complied with. So A is the Act, B is the governance standards, C is the external conduct standards, and those underlined opening words are not there in relation to the external conduct standards, and that is the case in relation to all of these enforcement mechanism toolbox issues available to the ACNC. And I just mentioned on this slide the specific carve-out under this Division 100 for basic religious charities. I want to finish with this, around the consequence, a black letter thing that can be measured around failure to record keep. We don't know a lot about the enforcement activity of the ACNC because it's cloaked in secrecy and there's secrecy provisions in the Act. But running a couple of searches across CaseBase, I stumbled across this defamation case of the ABC, of Fenn and the ABC, being litigated in the Victorian Supreme Court. And that there's been some skirmishes on the pleadings, both the first instance in the Victorian Supreme Court and in the Court of Appeal. And those pleadings set out a number of factors based on the ABC seeking to rely upon the truth defence about conduct that was taken against a particular charity for failure to record keep. So the ACNC, and these pleadings weren't contested either at first instance in the Supreme Court or in the Court of Appeal, so I imagine they're probably relatively truthful. The ACNC launched an investigation, the pleadings set out the purpose of the governance standards, the purpose of the regulatory regime of the ACNC, and then went on to say that the end result of this was that the charity had failed to comply with its record-keeping obligations for 2 consecutive years, and the charity registration was revoked retrospectively going back 3 years. So record-keeping, in compliance not just with the Act, but in compliance with these external conduct standards, and there is a black letter requirement in that regard, is going to be critical. Thank you.
Here's something I prepared to speak on. It's a prop. I'm a bit more comfortable with visuals, so I've prepared a slide to just illustrate the framework that INGOs are using at scale, so larger INGOs, and I'm conscious I've got colleagues in the room who will be familiar with this. I thought I'd use my 7 minutes to do 3 things, and first just to give you a snapshot, because many of you are in the advisory space, the regulatory space, and advising clients who are saying, well, what would a framework look like? So my first goal is to illustrate what a framework looks like that you might employ for compliance with standards at scale. The second thing I'd like to discuss is some reflections on the risks and challenges in actually implementing these in day-to-day practice, and particularly operationalising them overseas in countries where it's difficult to work geographically, politically and safety-wise, let alone rule of law and all the other things that are so important to the way we do our work in Australia. And the final thing I wanted to discuss is the importance of resource allocation and understanding the challenge that this poses to our sector where there are scarce or lean resources, and choices have to be made about where to allocate those resources and why. And I guess that links most closely to the talk that Rosemary gave about the importance of purpose in governance and the role our boards have in making sure that the allocation resources to achieve our purposes is done appropriately. So starting from the left to the right of the slide, it might seem like an obvious statement, but mapping the laws is a very important place to start in setting up a framework for standards. In charities, not many of them have in-house counsel, but they are strong on procedure. Sometimes those procedures have been sort of backdoored into the charity through a contract or a grant, or they previously worked in another charity, but they often don't know what the source of that actual procedure is. And so when their external context changes, when the law changes, they get a little bit caught out when suddenly that procedure that they previously had in place is no longer relevant. So in the context of external conduct standards, we're talking about, in Oxfam's case, roughly 160 Australian laws, plus the international laws of each of the 22 countries where we have programming, plus the laws of the Oxfam affiliates with whom we work in our network. So it can be a little bit hair-raising when you start doing that mapping, and then you go to Seek and you look for a job in an Australian charity that only works in Victoria and that doesn't fundraise interstate, and you kind of look for that kind of role. But so Map the Laws is a great place to start with your clients, and I take my hat off to the advisors in the room because I only have to do this for Oxfam, but some of you have a very broad client base and you'll need to do this and think about this in each of their contexts. We have had the benefit in the international humanitarian and development space of working with third-party standards, and I know that the ACNC have a statement on the ability of charities to reference third-party standards that they use as benchmarks for their work. So the second box from the left on the slide says sector standards. So accreditation for us with ACFID, the Australian Council for International Development, has really helped an organisation like Oxfam put in place robust codes of conduct, robust policies and procedures that are peer assessed. I think we've got Simon Miller here, who's on the Code of Conduct Committee and Seeking. And that really does strengthen and provide a resource to the sector that we've been able to build on and constantly develop. Grants agreements are a major source of standard setting. So when we receive DFAT grants, for example, or even grants from outside Australia, the European Union, for some of our work in the Pacific, they will often link into the delivery requirements compliance with particular laws and standards. As I move across the slide, I guess I'm wanting to give a sense that it's a cycle. It's not just get the policies and procedures started. And I do have a little box that says policy framework, and make sure that the policies reflect your values and that you publish your policies and that you actually have them. And that's where this prop comes in. So I mapped what are Oxfam's safeguarding policies. So that's just safeguarding children. So we have a similar folder on fraud, corruption, bribery, disability inclusion and environmental standards. And if you imagine you're the country director in Fiji and you get a grant agreement that says, oh, these are the safeguarding ones, and just now I'll just get in the tip truck for the 5 other folders of all the other standards, you begin to wonder how compliance is going to be practically possible. So I'll leave that thought about the layers of policies and procedures and the challenge that we have as a sector to be practical. And I'm channeling Annie Keeley and Selwyn's thinking here, where we're talking about appropriate cultural plain language, policies and procedures that are fit for purpose in the places where we work. So that, I think I've kind of made the point about the process of setting in place a framework, and the point about in the country where we work that we do need to pass these standards on through contracts, through training, through capacity assessments, thank you, and also through processes for when things go wrong, as they do. And in that case, you need strong investigation processes and procedures, handbooks, care for victims, and a process of reflection and learning, which brings me to my second point, the challenges of not creating the space for continuous development of these standards, when difficult choices are made about resource allocation, means that we might identify the problem, we might know it's there, but we don't learn from that and build from our mistakes. The final point I wanted to make about the challenge to the sector is why would we do this? Who stands to gain, and what is the purpose for bringing in high standards and investing resources in them? Well, when push comes to shove, it is the people that we serve, or the cause that we serve, the environment, the women and the children in the communities where we work. And it's our job, I think, to simplify, to collaborate very closely as a sector, which is an interesting challenge for competition talk later, to make sure that we provide a level of synthesis. Because in addition to our binder of safeguarding folders, the country director in Fiji will also have the USAID grant binder of safeguarding, the EU binder, the Asian Development Bank, and the Department of Foreign DFID binder of processes, and how they're going to work with partners, with third parties, to pass that on in a simplified way. So my big call out is to philanthropy to help us resource this project, to simplify and synthesise. We're already doing some initiatives in interagency referencing so that people cannot move between charities in an international setting, and that work is being led by a number of global agencies. But we need more work on this in the financial framework in particular, and in the protection of vulnerable people. So that's my challenge for philanthropy, and a similar challenge for the ACNC to help us develop tools for charities that don't have access to legal advice at cost or in-house lawyers. So thank you.